And it's Thursday. We almost made it to the weekend right here on the Morning Pitt on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. It's where we put a lot of Pitt video content, whether it's football, basketball, recruiting. Of course, these Morning Pitt videos Monday through Friday every morning, just to give you something to think about for the day. Get your Pitt conversation started each morning here on the Morning Pitt. And of course, we're coming up to the end of the week, getting ever closer to Pitt's game against Syracuse at Acrisure Stadium on Saturday, and we've obviously got a lot to talk about on that front. We've been talking about it all week. But while game day is still 2 days away on the football side, last night was game day on the basketball side, at least of the exhibition variety, which, you take that for what it's worth. Pitt beat up on Edinboro, I think 92-53. This follows their previous, 100-point to 50-point game. The win over Clarion in the first exhibition game. So Pitt won both their exhibition games, according to Jeff Capel, got out of it healthy. The guys who were expected to play didn't get hurt. There were no serious injuries. Obviously, there's situations with John Hughley and Will Jeffers. We'll talk about those in a second. But the regular season opener against Tennessee Martin is on Monday night. And so I thought today, we'll obviously talk a lot about Pitt-Syracuse tomorrow on the Morning Pitt. But since they played their final exhibition game last night, I thought maybe today would be a good time to recap a little bit of what we learned about Pitt basketball through 2 exhibition games. And I wrote about this after the first exhibition game. I wrote about it after we watched an open practice last Friday. I shared some thoughts that were along these lines. And then, I say it again after this game here, against Edinboro, that so much of this team and its success is riding on their shooting. And that was by design. And I think when you look at what Jeff Capel and his staff did this offseason, the players they added to this roster, what they really tried to emphasize, they needed some key spots. They needed a point guard. They needed a backup center and all that. But they needed shooting. They needed to add shooting. They needed to be better as a shooting team, because everybody knows where this team's strength is. Everybody knows who this team's best player is. Everybody knows what it's all going to kind of come down to, who's going to be the leader of this team, the primary contributor, and the guy that other teams circle is going to be John Hughley. And the problem last year, and that was the case last year as well, but the problem last year was that there was no real deterrent to stop teams from doubling John Hughley, from attacking John Hughley, from focusing all of their efforts and attention on John Hughley. And so life got very difficult for him, particularly as Pitt got into the ACC schedule. Now, he kept producing, he kept playing well, and I think the expectation is he would be able to do that again this year as a junior. But the truth is, if you can take a little bit of that pressure off of Hughley, he could become even more dynamic and even more impactful and even more successful, which would ultimately lead to your team being better. What's the way to do that? Is by adding shooting. Because Pitt had no shooting threat last year. Mo Gee was like the best 3-point shooting threat. Ethiel Horton was supposed to be, but it never really came to fruition. There was no threat from outside. And so teams were sort of free, unencumbered, to just get down in the post and make life very difficult for John Hughley. It's because he was the only player that they were afraid of. And the numbers sort of bear that out. I mean, not only was Pitt number 13 in the ACC in 3-point shooting percentage at 31.4, and not only were they number 15 in the ACC at 3-point field goals made with 172 over the course of the season, the number that really stands out to me, in addition to just being bad at shooting threes, is they didn't attempt many. Number 14 in the conference last year in 3-point field goal attempts. So not only were they not making many, they weren't even taking all that many. And there was no real threat. You need guys who are at least going to be willing to threaten the other team. And even if they don't hit the 3-point shots, they have to be just dangerous enough that if you leave them alone, if you don't close out quick enough, if you don't get out and defend those guys, they have the chance to knock it down, that they're willing to take their shots. And this is what I thought was most interesting about the Edinboro game last night. Blake Hinson, obviously 29 points, a game high, 10 of 14, just played a couple minutes in the second half. He did all of his damage in the first half, 10 of 14 from the floor, 5 of 8 from 3. And that was, remarkable. But what really stood out to me is this team started off the game last night, and they hit just 2 of their first 11 3-pointers. And the game actually, for the first 10 minutes, it was like a 4 or 5 point game. And you said, well, this is not how this is supposed to go. They're not supposed to be in a 4 or 5 point game against Edinburgh 10 minutes into the first half. But they were. And a big part of the reason why is because they were not hitting their threes. They kept attempting them, though. They kept shooting them. Like I say, they went 2 of their first 11. And then the floodgates opened. And particularly in the person of Blake Hinson. He hit 1, 2, 3, 4 3-pointers in a row. Then Greg Elliott made 1. Then Nate Santos made 1. And ultimately, Pitt made 6 3-pointers in a row. After opening 2 of 11, they hit 6 of their next 6. They hit 1 more in the first half and finished 9 of 21 in the first half from 3. So you go from 2 of 11 to 9 of 21. That's 7 out of your next 10 shots. And so what they showed, and in that first half against Edinburgh, was that 1, they were willing to take a lot of shots. They did, 21 3-pointers in the first half. 2, they would not be deterred if they were missing shots, which they were early on, like I say, 2 of their first 11. And 3, if they start to get hot, they've got guys on this team who can shoot really well. And so you end up with 6 players on the team making a 3-pointer in that game last night. Nelly Cummings had 1. Greg Elliott had 1. Nate Santos made 1. KJ Marshall, the walk-on guard, came off the bench and nailed a 3. Nike Sabandi hit a couple. And, of course, Blake Hinson made 5. Shot 5 of 8 from outside the arc. And last night was Hinson's night. Last night, Hinson was hot. It would not surprise me if Greg Elliott had a 5 of 8 game. It would not surprise me if Nate Santos had a 5 of 8 game. Those 3 guys in particular are your biggest shooters, your best shooters. And then, Nelly Cummings went 1 of 3 from 3. He actually hit the first basket of the game. It was a 3-pointer. So when I talk about that stat that they hit 2 of their first 11, Cummings hit the first one, and then they hit 1 of the next 10. So, I mean, they really went into a slump and dug themselves a little bit of a hole that against better competition, certainly ACC competition, they're not going to be sitting at 17 to 12, sitting on a 17 to 12 lead with 10 minutes left to play in the first half when they shoot like that. They're going to be in a deeper hole, but they've got the ability to shoot themselves out of it. And, it might be Hinson who makes a bunch. It might be Elliott who makes a bunch. It might be Santos who makes a bunch. Or you might get a few from those guys, and then Cummings chips in a few, and Sabandi chips in a few, and Jamarius Burton chips in a few. This team has a lot of guys who can shoot well and also are willing to take a lot of those shots. So Pitt ended up with 34 3-point attempts in that game last night. This is after the Clarion game where they shot 28 3-point attempts. So they had 62 3-point attempts over the course of 2 exhibition games. Exhibition games are what they are. They're not necessarily a harbinger of things to come. But I think in terms of philosophy, the way you watch this team play and the way they were willing to keep shooting in 2 games, even when the shots went cold, that they weren't deterred, that's pretty remarkable to me. And Jeff Capel made an interesting point after the game, and I thought the fact that he emphasized this, I thought he was saying more than just the words that he said. But he talked about how in the first half, the team figured out, and Blake Hinson mentioned this as well, once they figured out that Hinson was hot, that Hinson was nailing shots, everybody tried to get him the ball. Everybody tried to get Blake Hinson the ball when they realized that he was the hot hand. And Blake Hinson said that, he was asked, what was working for you tonight, or why were you shooting so well tonight? He said, they just kept getting me the ball, and I had open shots, and I kept knocking them down. And Jeff Capel pointed it out, though, and talked about assists, and talked about how it was exciting because the team recognized that Hinson was shooting well, and they kept getting him the ball. And I don't know if he intended that as a comparison to last season, but it sure sort of felt like one. That when there's a hot hand, nobody cares about themselves anymore. They want to get it to that hot hand. And so you end up with Nelly Cummings had 5 assists all in the first half. Jamarius Burton had 5 assists. Hinson had 3 assists. Nike Sabandi had 1. Jorge Diaz-Graham had 1. Federico had 1. Greg Elliott had an assist. There were 17 assists total on 31 made baskets, probably with like a higher percentage than that, but it's pretty good numbers for what they were doing and how they were making shots. And so, it's interesting, I think, to look at this team, how this team approached the first 2 exhibition games, what their approach was as a team, how they played individually, you don't want to read too much into it. I don't know if they're going to attempt 34 three-pointers in a game against an ACC team. I don't know if they'll have, I don't know if they'll have that many shots. They have 67 possessions or something like that in this game. I don't know if they'll have enough to be able to pull that off against ACC teams. But, I think the underlying philosophy behind that approach is something they will try to carry into ACC games. And I think it is notable, and Jeff Capel pointed this out last night as well, it is notable that they've done what they've done in these two exhibition games without John Hughley. That maybe because they don't have Hughley, they've learned to lean on each other even more than they would have otherwise. Because they didn't have sort of that outlet, that safety blanket of just get it to Hughley and he'll make the plays. They didn't have that. They had to take care of business themselves. And we'll talk about the center rotation in a second. But they had to do it themselves, and they had to learn to lean on each other in the absence of Hughley, which Jeff Capel suggested, and I think he might be onto something, should make them better, ideally will make them better once Hughley does return. That they'll have all this experience playing together, and then you add in the team's best player, it should only elevate the level they're playing at. Simply having the threat to shoot threes, I think, will make a big impact. And this team has not players who are willing to not just be a threat to shoot, but also a threat to make three-pointers. So you come out of the exhibition season and you don't read too much into stats other than some of those things like, well, how many threes did they attempt? How many times did they assist on made baskets? I'm not as concerned about rebounding. Yeah, they out-rebounded Edinboro by 7. I'm not as concerned about that. They only committed 10 turnovers. You always want that number to be as low as possible. They forced 24 turnovers on Edinboro. Again, you read a little bit into that in terms of aggressiveness and how they defended, but not too much. What you really look at is, I think things you want to take away from the exhibition is what can you tell about sort of philosophy and approach and, what we see particularly with how often these guys are shooting. And then you want to get some sense of the rotation. They right now have 11 scholarship players on the roster. 9 were available for the game last night in the Clarion game. Will Jeffers and John Hughley both out with injuries right now. Jeff Capel had originally said he hoped to have Hughley and Jeffers ready for the regular season opener against Tennessee Martin on Monday night. But he said last night that's not going to happen. And he hopes they have an update by Monday night about the status of those two players and when they'll be back. He doesn't seem to think it's too serious. But obviously the sooner the better. The sooner those guys can get back into practice, let alone get back into games, would be the better for this team, obviously. So 9 scholarship players is what they've been working with for these 2 games. And all 9 have played. You know what I mean? Even last night, let's see, I think, Jorge Diaz-Graham played 15 minutes. That was the fewest of any of the scholarship players. The walk-ons, KJ Marshall and Aiden Fish, played 6 minutes and 3 minutes respectively. It's going to be interesting to see how this rotation pairs down. I think with Hughley and Jeffers out, that leaves them with, 9 scholarship guys. And I think all 9 are going to have to play. Part of that is because 5 of those 9 are guards, right? And Nelly Cummings and Jamarius Burton and Nike Sabandi and Greg Elliott and Nate Santos. And then you have your 2 sort of forwards, your 4s, if you want to call them that, and Blake Hinson and Jorge Diaz-Graham, and then your 2 centers, and Fede Federico and Guillermo Diaz-Graham. Because you're going to need, I think you're going to need to be able to rotate at the 4 and the 5, you're going to need both of those guys to play at each of those spots, which means you're going to need both of the Diaz-Graham twins to play, even if it's in a reserve role behind Hinson and Federico. And then I don't really know which one of those 5 guards you sit down. I think Nate Santos provides some shooting. I've talked about how I think he's a bit of a forgotten man in this rotation for this season. We talk so much about so many guys, and we kind of forget what Nate Santos can potentially do. I mean, he's a shooter. And we talk about this team needing shooting. I mean, Nate Santos, I think as the season progresses, can grow more and more into a role. Now, he was 1 of 7 from 3 last night against Edinboro. That's not ideal. I don't think he's going to go 1 and 7 every game. I think you want him shooting 5, 6, 7 threes every game because there are going to be a lot of nights, I think, where he hits 3, 4, or 5 of them. So, I mean, even he's going to be in the rotation. Nelly Cummings and Jamarius Burton and Nike Sabandi and Greg Elliott are in. Those 4 are definitely playing. Blake Hinson, same way. Those 5 are definitely playing. Whether Will Jeffress is in there, whether John Hughley's in there, whether those guys are not available, those 5 are definitely playing, right? So when you look at what it's going to be on Monday night against Tennessee Martin, you've got those 5. I think Nate Santos is in there. And then you need reserves. You need rotation at the 4 and the 5. You can't play Blake Hinson for 40 minutes. You can't play Federico for 40 minutes. So the Diaz-Graham twins are going to have to be in the mix for now. Once you get this team back to full health, they get to 11 scholarship players. They have John Hughley available. They have Will Jeffress available. I think those, now your rotation at the 4 is Blake Hinson and Will Jeffress, and your rotation at the 5 is John Hughley and Federico. And I think the Twins see some of their playing time go down. But as long as Jeffress and Hughley are out, I think the Twins are going to play a decent amount, maybe something close to what they played tonight, 19 and 15. I could see that. We saw Pitt go with some smaller lineups. They had a lineup out there that was Hinson was the 5. I forget who the 4 guards were, but it was 4 guards and Blake Hinson. And then at the end, we saw them play with all 3 of the biggest guys, the Twins and Federico on the court at the same time. So we saw sort of the extremes last night of the smallest possible lineup and the biggest possible lineup. I don't think you'll see either one of those extremes in most games this season. Maybe a few minutes with that small lineup with Blake Hinson playing the 5. But I don't think you're going to see the Twins and Federico on the court together much, if at all, once the season starts. But it'll be interesting to see how that rotation pairs down and how the depth pairs down. It seems like there's decent depth on this team in some spots. I think they're deep at guard. I think they're very deep in the backcourt. I think they're deep with veteran players in the backcourt, particularly with Cummings, Sabandi, Burton, and Elliott, and then Santos coming in as a sophomore, getting more time there. And I think you work him in. You work Nate Santos in. You want him to be an integral piece of this offense because of his shooting and because of what he means for your future. I mean, he's a young player that you're going to be counting on, I think, down the road. And so I think you do want to work him in this year along with those veteran guards for what he can provide and how he can grow and how he can develop. The rotation in the front court, though, is going to have to be what it is, and you're going to need the Twins to provide something. And I think those guys have been pretty intriguing. I don't think they've been bad. There have been times where they look out of place. But on the whole, I think they've done intriguing things. There's some blocks where they obviously use their length and their size. They can make plays around the basket. Decent shooters. They have some of that European skill set that you always see and hear about. And Pitt really has, they have 2 of them now who can do it. So much of this, though, is going to be Guillermo Diaz-Graham and Federico trying to hold the fort together until John Hughley returns. This team is at its best, obviously, when Hughley is playing out there. And, that's what everything has to be building to. You just don't want to blow it against anybody in between, between now and Hughley's return, whenever that may be. And I think overall, I'm intrigued by this team. We talked in the preseason about what this team could be, about who they are, and how they're built. I was really intrigued by it because I thought Jeff Capel hasn't had a team like this before. He's never had a veteran point guard like Nelly Cummings. The closest he got, I guess he had Xavier Johnson as a junior. But Johnson wasn't a point guard the way that Nelly Cummings is a point guard. This is a different kind of point guard than Capel has had. And then he's got Jamarius Burton who can run the point. And he had Nike Sabandi running the point a little bit last night. He's got a number of guys who can handle the ball like that. He's got a bunch of shooters. He's got a bunch of veteran guards, in addition to a player who could legitimately be an all-conference player in John Hughley. Capel has not had a roster like this. He's not had a roster makeup like this for a variety of reasons. They tried to build it one way. They made adjustments over the last 3 or 4 years trying to build it in different ways, and now they're trying something they really haven't either tried or had the opportunity to try in the way this roster is constructed. And I'm intrigued by it. This is the best shooting roster that Jeff Capel has had. I mean, we'll see if the numbers bear that out. But I mean, just looking at the history of Greg Elliott and Blake Hinson, looking at what Nate Santos can do. There have been previous Capel teams where guys like a Nelly Cummings and a Jamarius Burton and a Nike Sabandy would be the main source of three-point shooting, or the guys you were going to count on. You've got legitimate shooters now in Elliott, Hinson, and Santos. And so that's unique. Having all these veteran guards is unique. Having a player like Hughley is unique. We haven't seen a Jeff Capel team that looked like this. We know all the other Jeff Capel teams, and the way they looked, it all failed. Sometimes rather spectacularly failed. But we haven't seen a team that looks like this. And so these other ways of building a team kind of went bust. Let's see what this one can do. Veteran guards, should be a willing group of shooters, and potentially even successful group of shooters, with John Hughley playing as a junior, ideally at the peak of his powers, at least to this point in his career. You do need to get Hughley back sooner rather than later. That's going to be sort of a negative storyline that surrounds this team until Hughley returns, and not just until he returns, but until he returns and gets back to full health, when he gets back to 100%, which who knows how long that will be. And so you're counting on that, and there's going to be some elements of survive until Hughley returns. But in the meantime, while you're waiting for that, I think these guys, whether it's Greg Elliott or Blake Hinson or even Nelly Cummings and the two returning guards and Burton and Sabandy, they're going to further learn how to carry the team themselves. They know what they have coming back. They know who's going to arrive at some point in the future in John Hughley, and they know what impact he can make. But these guys are going to have to learn to do things themselves too, of how they can take over a game, how they can win a game, how they can make an impact. I like the makeup of this team. I really do. Like I say, it's unique from what we've seen, and I'm intrigued to see what they can do. I really am. And it'll start next Monday night. Tennessee Martin, 7 o'clock tip-off at the Peterson Events Center. From there, it's a go. West Virginia, I think, on the following Friday. So we've got that to look forward to, which is nice. All right, I appreciate you joining me for a little Pitt basketball talk today. We'll be back into the football talk tomorrow. Look at Pitt Syracuse from every angle possible and preview all the other games in the Coastal Division for the weekend. It's a big weekend coming up for Pitt with this game against Syracuse. I mean, the last 4 games have been must-win. So, I mean, I can't really say, this is the must-win game. They've all been must-win games. They've all been desperation games, particularly the last couple of weeks. And this Syracuse game is right there, right along with it. So, that's a big one. We'll have a lot to talk about as that goes tomorrow. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Like this video. We appreciate that very much. And then go check out Panther-Lair.com. Panther-Lair.com. Pittsburgh.rivals.com. The most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet, football, basketball, and recruiting. Panther-Lair.com. Thanks so much for tuning in. We appreciate it. We will see you on the message boards, and we'll talk to you tomorrow morning for the final Morning Pit of the week right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.